me at night going, hey, Clint.
That was damn good.
I don't dwell on those, I just kind of move on.
Clint Eastwood has spent 94 years never letting the world see him break. He walked into a live television studio in the spring of 2025, sat down under the lights, and said 4 words that no one in that room was prepared to hear. The broadcast that stopped America.
It's dull. It's, nobody's enjoying. I grew up in a neighborhood with lots of different types of people.
I would set the record straight. I can confirm I've turned 95. I can also confirm that I never gave an interview to an Austrian publication.
It was a Tuesday evening in March of 2025, the kind of quiet weeknight when most people are halfway through dinner and only half watching the screen. Nobody had any reason to expect that the program airing that night would become one of the most talked about television moments of the entire year. Clint Eastwood walked onto the set of a primetime interview program and took his seat with the same unhurried calm that has defined every public appearance he has made for the last 6 decades. He was wearing a dark jacket. His hands were folded in his lap. He looked, at first glance, exactly like the man the world has always known. Controlled, measured, unreadable. The host began with the usual warm-up questions: career, legacy, the films he was still working on, at an age when most men his generation had long since stopped working at all. Eastwood answered each one in that familiar low drawl, giving just enough to satisfy the question without giving anything extra away. The studio audience laughed when he wanted them to laugh. They leaned in when he paused. Everything felt completely normal for the first 7 minutes. Then the host asked about his family. The shift was subtle at first. Eastwood's hands, which had been completely still in his lap, moved. He looked down for just a moment. Not long enough for most people to catch in real time, but long enough that the clip would be replayed hundreds of thousands of times in the days that followed, with viewers pointing at exactly that half second as the moment the armor came off. He looked back up and said the words plainly. No performance around them, no build-up. Just the words themselves, delivered in the same voice he has used to deliver every line in every film he has ever made. Except this time, there was no script behind them and no director to call cut. The host went quiet. One of the producers later told a trade publication that the entire control room felt silent the moment those words landed. A floor assistant who had worked on the show for 11 years told the same publication that she had never seen a guest do what Eastwood did in that moment, which was simply stop talking and let the silence do the rest. America watched a 94-year-old man sit with something heavy in a way that felt entirely private, even though millions of people were watching him do it. Social media registered the moment before the segment had even finished airing on the East Coast. Clips were being cut and uploaded while the interview was still in progress on the West Coast feed. By the time most of the country went to sleep that night, the broadcast had already generated more online conversation than anything else that had aired that week on any network. What made it land so hard was not just what Eastwood said, it was everything that surrounded the saying of it. The stillness, the lack of any attempt to wrap the moment in something more comfortable. People who have spent decades watching this man project absolute invincibility on screen were suddenly watching him be a human being on a Tuesday night in March. And they did not quite know what to do with that. The host recovered first, as hosts are trained to do. She gently guided the conversation forward, and Eastwood followed her lead. The rest of the interview continued. He spoke about his current project. He made a dry joke that got the audience laughing again. The program ended on schedule, but nobody who watched that broadcast was thinking about the current project or the dry joke when they turned off their television that night. They were thinking about those 4 words, and about the expression that had crossed his face for the 3 seconds after he said them, and about what it means when a man who has made an entire career out of saying nothing more than he has, to suddenly says something he clearly has been carrying for a very long time. To understand what broke the surface that night, you have to go back much further than March of 2025. You have to go back to the life that Clint Eastwood has actually been living when the cameras were not on him. And that life is considerably more complicated than the legend. The man behind the legend. Clint Eastwood was born on the 31st of May, 1930, in San Francisco, California. He grew up during the Depression, moved frequently as a child, and learned early that the world did not particularly care whether you were comfortable or not. You adapted or you fell behind. He adapted. The career that followed is almost impossible to summarize without it sounding like fiction. He spent the 1950s doing bit parts in forgettable films before Rawhide turned him into a household name across America. Then, Sergio Leone took him to Italy and turned him into something else entirely. The Man with No Name trilogy made Eastwood an international icon before he was 40. Dirty Harry made him a cultural institution. Every Which Way But Loose showed he could make the whole country laugh. Unforgiven won him the Academy Award for Best Director in 1993 and reminded everyone who had started to take him for granted exactly what he was capable of. He kept going. Most directors slow down in their 70s. Eastwood accelerated. Million Dollar Baby, Letters from Iwo Jima, Gran Torino, American Sniper, Sully, Richard Jewell, Cry Macho. He was directing films in his 90s the way other men his age were tending gardens, and the films were not vanity projects. They were serious, studied, commercially successful pieces of work that continued to draw major stars and major audiences. The public image that accompanied all of this was granite. Eastwood became the living symbol of a particular kind of American masculinity. Quiet, self-reliant, unbothered by what other people thought. He gave interviews sparingly and on his own terms. He was famously private about his personal life, even as that personal life became genuinely complicated in ways that tabloids spent decades trying to map. And it was complicated. There is no clean way to tell the story of Clint Eastwood's family without acknowledging that it is a large, layered, and occasionally fractured thing. He has 8 children across multiple relationships. Scott Eastwood, who has built his own film career and carries a physical resemblance to his father that stops people on the street. Kyle Eastwood, a respected jazz musician based in Paris. Allison Eastwood, an actress and director who has quietly built a life away from the spotlight. Kimber Eastwood, from a relationship that predated his first marriage. Francesca Eastwood, whose mother is the actress Frances Fisher. Morgan Eastwood, the youngest, born from his long relationship with television personality Dina Ruiz. Each of those children represents a chapter of a life that has not followed a straight line. Eastwood was married twice. His first marriage to Maggie Johnson lasted 31 years on paper, though the relationship had effectively ended long before the divorce was finalized. His second marriage to Dina Ruiz ended in 2013. After Dina, he spent several years in a relationship with actress Erica Anderson before that. 2 eventually ended. The point is not to catalog the complexity as a criticism. The point is that behind the icon, there has always been a man navigating the same kinds of emotional terrain that eventually finds everyone: loss, estrangement, the particular silence that settles between parents and children when time and distance have done their slow work. People who know Eastwood well have said consistently, across decades of profiles and interviews, that he is genuinely difficult to read in private. Not cold exactly, but contained in a way that makes it hard to know what he is actually feeling at any given moment. One longtime collaborator told a film journalist years ago that working with Eastwood was like working beside a still lake. The surface told you almost nothing about the depth underneath. That description matters for what happened in March of 2025, because the man who sat down in that studio chair that night was not a man who had spent his life performing emotion. He was a man who had spent his life suppressing it, and that is precisely why, when something finally crossed his face under those studio lights, the whole country felt it hit. The grief that surfaced that night did not arrive suddenly. It had been building for years, in private, in the way that grief tends to build in people who have never learned how to put it anywhere. What that grief was rooted in is exactly where this story goes next. The loss he carried longest. There is a particular kind of grief that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a single devastating moment that the world can point to and understand. It accumulates quietly in the background of an otherwise functioning life, until one day it is simply too large to keep behind the eyes. That is the grief Clint Eastwood brought into that studio in March of 2025. The loss that hit him hardest in his final years was not one that made the front pages when it happened. It was not the kind of loss that generates a flood of public tributes or stops a news cycle. It was the quieter, more personal kind, the kind that only the people closest to you understand the full weight of. Sandra Locke had been the great complicated love of Eastwood's middle life. They met on the set of The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1975, when Eastwood was 45 and Locke was 28. What followed was a relationship that lasted 14 years and produced some of his best work. They made 6 films together. They shared a home. By every account from people who observed them during those years, they were genuinely intertwined in a way that went far beyond professional collaboration. The ending was brutal. Locke sued Eastwood in 1989 after he had the locks changed on the home they shared while she was away. The lawsuit was settled out of court, but the details that leaked into the press were damaging and painful for everyone involved. Locke eventually wrote a memoir that described the relationship and its ending in terms that were unsparing. Eastwood never publicly responded in kind. He maintained his silence the way he maintained silence about everything personal. Sandra Locke died in November of 2018 from breast cancer and heart disease at the age of 74. Her death was not reported publicly until months after it actually occurred, a detail that struck many people as unbearably sad when it eventually came out. She had died quietly, with almost no public acknowledgement, after a life that had once been played out in very public circumstances. Eastwood said nothing publicly when her death was finally confirmed, but people close to him said that the news hit him in a way he struggled to process. Not because the relationship had ended well, because it had not, but because the ending of a relationship and the death of the person are 2 entirely different losses, and the second one closes a door that the first one had always, technically, left open. That unspoken grief sat in him for years. Then came the losses that were harder still to absorb because they were closer and more recent. The entertainment world that Eastwood had inhabited for 7 decades began thinning around him in ways that became impossible to ignore. Colleagues he had made films with, directors he had respected, actors he had come up alongside in the early years when Hollywood was a different place entirely. But the loss that his family has spoken about most carefully, in the rare moments when they have spoken about it at all, is the one that involves his own mortality and what he is watching it do to the people around him. Eastwood turned 94 in May of 2024. At that age, every public appearance carries an unspoken weight that younger public figures simply do not have to carry. People look at him differently now. They listen to him differently. There is a quality to the attention he receives that he has described in interviews as both humbling and slightly suffocating, because it carries within it the awareness that there will not be unlimited opportunities left for these conversations. His son Scott spoke to a men's magazine in late 2024 about what it is like to watch his father age. He chose his words with obvious care. He said that his father remained sharper than people expected and more physically present than his age would suggest. But he also said that the family had begun having conversations they had not needed to have before. The kind of conversations about legacy and time and what gets said before the window closes. Those conversations had been happening privately inside the Eastwood family for the better part of 2 years before March of 2025. What the public did not know, going into that Tuesday night broadcast, was that Eastwood had lost someone in his immediate circle in the months just prior to the interview. Someone whose absence had reshuffled something fundamental inside him. The details remain private, in keeping with the family's long-standing approach to anything genuinely personal. But the effect of that loss was visible to anyone who knew where to look. His longtime assistant, a woman who had worked with him for over 2 decades and who was described by multiple people in his production circle as the person who actually kept his daily life running, had stepped back from her role due to her own serious health complications. For a man of Eastwood's age and habits, that kind of disruption to the fabric of daily life carries an emotional weight that goes well beyond the practical inconvenience. And underneath all of it was the thing that nobody in his circle said out loud, but that everyone was thinking. At 94, every loss feels different than it did at 64 or 74. Every loss now arrives with the awareness that you are not going to have the decades ahead of you that once made grief feel survivable in a different way. Eastwood sat with all of that when he walked into that studio in March of 2025. He was not planning to let any of it show. He never plans to let anything show. But something about the specific question the host asked in that specific moment, with those specific lights and that specific silence around him, moved something that had been sitting still for a very long time. What came out of his mouth next is what the whole country is still talking about. The words, "He could barely finish." The host's name was reasonably well known in American television circles. She had conducted hundreds of high-profile interviews over the course of her career and had a reputation for making difficult guests feel comfortable enough to say things they had not necessarily planned to say. That skill, the particular gift of knowing when to push and when to simply wait, is exactly what created the conditions for what happened next. She had been speaking with Eastwood for roughly 7 minutes about his most recent film project when she made the pivot. It was not an aggressive pivot. It was gentle, almost conversational in its framing. She told him that she wanted to ask him something a little more personal, if that was all right. And Eastwood, in his characteristic way, gave a small nod that communicated both permission and mild skepticism about where the question was going. She asked him how he was doing, not in the way that people ask that question as a formality, in the way that signals they actually want to know the answer. Eastwood looked at her for a moment. Then he said that he had recently lost someone who had meant a great deal to him, and then he stopped. Not because he had finished the thought, because he had not quite decided yet how much further he was going to take it. The host waited. This is the part that the people who have watched the clip dozens of times come back to again and again. She did not fill the silence. She did not offer a sympathetic sound or a gentle prompt. She just waited, and in doing so, she gave him the room to decide for himself what came next. What came next was 4 words that landed in that studio like something physical. He said he missed them. 3 syllables delivered in a voice that had not changed in register or volume at all, except that somewhere underneath the familiar low tone, there was something that had not been there 7 minutes earlier. A texture that was not grief performed for an audience, but grief simply present in a room. The host's expression shifted. Not dramatically, but her eyes changed in a way that cameras catch even when faces are trying to stay professional. Eastwood did not cry. It is important to say that clearly because many of the headlines that followed the broadcast implied something more visually dramatic than what actually occurred. He did not break down. He did not require a pause in filming. He sat in the same position he had been sitting in for the entire interview. But something had crossed his face in the 3 seconds after he said those words that was unmistakable to everyone watching, in the studio and at home. It was the expression of a man who had been keeping something in a very specific place inside himself for a long time, and who had, for just a moment, let it be somewhere else. He recovered quickly, or rather, he redirected quickly, which is not exactly the same thing. He said that getting older had a way of making you take stock of things. He said that the people who had walked alongside him for the longest stretches of his life were the ones he found himself thinking about most. He said that when you reached his age, and he said his age with a brief dry smile that got a soft laugh from the studio audience, you stopped pretending that time was something you had unlimited amounts of. That line got more attention than perhaps any other single line in the interview. Film writers and cultural commentators spent the following days turning it over from every angle. For a man who had spent his entire public life projecting the image of someone entirely unbothered by time and consequence, saying plainly on live television that time was something he was now acutely aware of, running short and represented a kind of admission that his audience had never heard from him before. He was not being morbid. That is the detail that gets lost in some of the coverage. He was not performing sadness or fishing for sympathy. He was simply stating a fact in the same direct way he has always stated facts, except this particular fact happened to be about his own finitude, and hearing it in that voice from that face hit people somewhere they were not expecting. The host asked him gently whether he wanted to say anything more about the person he had lost. Eastwood considered this for a visible moment. Then he said that some things were better kept close. He said the people who needed to know already knew, and the people who did not need to know did not need to know. Then he looked directly at the camera rather than at the host when he said the last part, which several television critics noted was an unusual and striking choice that felt almost like he was speaking to someone specific who might be watching. That detail, the direct camera look, became one of the most discussed elements of the broadcast in the days that followed. Viewers speculated endlessly about who he might have been addressing, his children, a former partner, someone from the long arc of his professional life who he had lost touch with and wanted to reach. Nobody knew for certain. Eastwood did not clarify. What he did do in the final minutes of the interview was return to the subject of his work. He talked about the film he was currently finishing, He said that staying in the work was the thing that kept him oriented when everything else felt less certain than it used to. He said that he had never been a man who knew how to sit still, and that he did not intend to start learning that particular skill at 94. The audience laughed again, warmly and with obvious affection. The interview ended, the credits rolled, and the conversation that had been building in living rooms and on phones and on social media since the moment those 4 words landed did not stop for days. His children, several of whom had been watching the broadcast from different parts of the world, had their phones in their hands before the program had even finished airing. What they said in the hours and days that followed told the rest of the story that Eastwood himself had chosen not to tell. What his children said afterward.
When a child grows up with a celebrity parent in Los Angeles, but I have been living in Los Angeles since
The responses came in stages. With a family as large and scattered as the Eastwood family, there is no single coordinated statement. What happens instead is a series of individual moments, each one revealing a slightly different angle of the same truth. Scott Eastwood was first. He posted on social media the morning after the broadcast, and the brevity of the post said almost as much as the words themselves. He wrote that his father was the strongest man he had ever known, and that strength looked different at different points in a life, and that what the world had seen the night before was not weakness. It was the opposite of weakness. The post gathered hundreds of thousands of responses within hours. Kyle Eastwood took longer, which was consistent with his general approach to public life. Kyle has lived in Paris for many years, building a serious jazz career that operates almost entirely outside the Hollywood ecosystem his father created. When he did speak, it was in an interview with a French music publication later picked up by American outlets. He said that his father had always expressed things through work rather than words, and that hearing him speak directly on television the way he had was significant in a way the family understood better than anyone watching from outside. He said the family had known for some time that his father was carrying something heavy, and that seeing it surface on that broadcast had been, in a strange way, a relief. Not because the grief was gone, because it was no longer being carried entirely alone. That word, alone, landed hard. Allison Eastwood gave no formal interview, but she was seen at her father's Carmel home the week after the broadcast, arriving quietly on a Wednesday. She did not stop to speak to anyone. Her presence said what she had chosen not to say in words. Francesca Eastwood was more direct. She wrote on her social media that watching her father reminded her that the people we consider invincible are still people. She said her dad had given the world decades of strength, and that it was all right for the world to give some of that back now. The response that generated the most conversation came from Morgan Eastwood, the youngest, born in 1996. She posted a short video rather than a written statement. She sat in what appeared to be her home, looked at the camera, and said simply that her dad was still here, still himself, and that the family was together. She was visibly emotional when she said it. From the youngest child, those few words felt like the most honest summary of everything the broadcast had stirred. What all the responses shared was a single underlying acknowledgement. Something had shifted inside the family, not catastrophically, but in the way things shift when a private truth becomes briefly public and everyone has to decide at once how to hold it. What Eastwood returned to after that broadcast tells the final part of this story. The legacy. He is now racing to protect. Clint Eastwood went back to work the week after the broadcast. This surprised nobody who knows him. Work has always been the place where Eastwood makes sense of things that do not make sense anywhere else. It has been that way since Rawhide. It has been that way for 70 years. What was different this time was the pace. People inside his production company, Malpazzo Productions, which he has run out of the Warner Brothers lot since 1967, noted in the months following the broadcast that Eastwood was moving with a kind of focused urgency that even by his standards was striking. He was arriving earlier, he was making decisions faster. He was, by multiple accounts from people working alongside him, behaving like a man who had done a precise calculation about how much time remained and had decided that nothing was going to be left unfinished. The film he was completing in early 2025 was being described by people close to the production as one of the most personal things he had ever made. Eastwood himself said in a brief exchange with a journalist on the Warner Brothers lot in February of 2025, just weeks before the broadcast, that he was not interested in making anything that did not matter to him anymore. He said he had made enough films for other reasons and that the ones left were going to be made purely because he had something to say. For a man who has directed over 40 films across 6 decades, that statement carried considerable weight. His son Scott visited the set multiple times during the production. Kyle flew in from Paris at least once. The children who had responded so publicly to the March broadcast were, by multiple accounts, making a quiet collective effort to be more physically present in their father's life than they had managed to be in recent years. The distance that accumulates naturally in large families across busy decades was being deliberately shortened. Eastwood turned 95 in May of 2025. The birthday was marked privately, without the kind of industry celebration that his age and stature might have warranted. A small gathering at his Carmel home, family. A handful of people who had been part of his life long enough to simply show up without needing an occasion explained to them. No cameras, no statements, no broadcast. Just a man at the end of a very long and very full life, surrounded by the people who knew him before the legend and who will know him after it. The film he was racing to finish is his answer to everything that surfaced in that March studio. It is his way of saying what he could not quite finish saying under those lights. Clint Eastwood has never needed many words. He has always trusted the work to carry what the words could not. He still does. Clint Eastwood sat under those studio lights and let the world see something real for the first time in 94 years. His children answered. His work continues. Some men leave statues behind. Eastwood is leaving something harder to define and far more difficult to forget.